All right.
Great.
So let's start. So hello, everyone, and welcome to another expert session number 116. First and foremost, I want to say thanks to our sponsor, Acclaim AI. Acclaim helps enterprises deploy AI agents into regulated environments. Their relevance here is simple. AI is no longer just assisting workflows. It is increasingly executing them. What is Evolve? Evolve is a global private network and operating layer connecting senior commerce leaders, advisors, founders, investors, and operators across markets. The expert sessions are designed to surface operational realities, strategic shifts, and market intelligence before they become obvious. Our expert today, Fadi Abhinader. So Fadi Abhinader is the Global VP of Digital Sales Transformations at Mars Incorporated, where he leads what is arguably one of the largest AI-enabled sales transformation initiatives in global CPG today. His work focuses on agentifying end-to-end sales operations across one of the world's most iconic brand portfolios, embedding AI into commercial workflows at scale. Fadi brings 22 years of hands-on general management and commercial leadership, including full P&L ownership across 140 plus markets, and a track record of delivering over 1 billion in incremental revenue. Before stepping into his current global role, he served as regional general manager for Mars Egypt and Lebanon, where he quadrupled turnover in 4 years while navigating political revolutions and economic crises. What makes Fadi particularly relevant today is that he has built and scaled commercial systems under pressure and is now rebuilding them again, this time with AI at the core. Right, Fadi, I always start our sessions with a controversial opening question. And this session is going to be about, yes, AI, of course, but about the Middle East, more importantly, emerging markets in the Middle East. So my question for you is, for decades, Europe and the US built commercial systems on top of legacy layers. So fragmented ERPs, outdated distributor models, disconnected retail infrastructure, slow-moving organizational structures. Much of that infrastructure was built long before AI existed. The Middle East is in a different position. Across parts of the region, governments and enterprises are still building major pieces of digital and commercial infrastructure from the ground up. And that creates a different possibility. Fewer legacy constraints, faster implementation cycles, and the ability to embed AI directly into new systems rather than retrofit old ones. So the question is, can the Middle East leapfrog the rest of the world in AI-driven commerce precisely because it is building later?
Well, thank you, Carlos. Thank you, Gustavo, Prakash, for inviting me today. Really a pleasure to be here with all the gurus. I'm not an AI expert. I'm a commercial expert who is now leading a digital transformation for Mars. And thanks for the kind words, Carlos. So as I was saying, the Middle East or developing markets in general have a massive advantage. So I'm leading this transformation globally. And obviously, as you can imagine, the bulk of the work is in more developed markets. This is where the infrastructure and the data is. But believe it or not, I believe that developing markets have a big advantage. And they can leapfrog like they did in a couple of previous technologies, like mobile phones, for example. And we'll touch on that. You've touched on some of the reasons, but there's a bigger one. So you've touched on the governments being very much in favor of digitization and embedding AI in developing markets, in the Middle East specifically, in Egypt even more specifically. That's not the case in developed markets. On the contrary, in developed markets, the governments are not slowing technology down, but they are looking at it with a cautious eye, and we've seen some of the latest modules being put on hold, et cetera, et cetera. In the Middle East, there is very strong government encouragement. mobile penetration and usage is massive, massive. For infrastructure reasons, because there's no basic infrastructure. That's why everything has to happen on mobile. But I think the main reason why developing markets have a reason to leapfrog is that the basics are not there. The infrastructure is not there. So it's much easier to implement something new, and any AI system has to be built from the ground up. It doesn't replace an old system. So it's much easier to build something from the ground up when there's nothing built from the ground up. So think of developed markets. They have ERP systems, they have SAP, they have. So when you come and try to dismantle all of this and build it, possible, and all companies are doing that in a way, but it's more difficult. While in developing markets, it is easier. There are other obstacles, obviously, but it is easier. Think of technologies like the mobile phone. Why is the mobile phone everywhere in rural places in Africa or in India? While if you go to developed markets, you still get calls from the bank on your landline. You still get calls from the municipality on your landline. You still get letters. I live in Egypt. I get nothing of that. Everything is on mobile, simply because you can't get a letter, or you don't have. I haven't had a landline for 10 years, right? That's why mobile penetration and doing everything on mobile is the only way to go. So there are technologies in mobile payments, for example. If you go to extremely rural places in Bangladesh or Uzbekistan, you'll see people buying vegetables from a vegetable cart in a very rural place, paying with their mobile. If you go to the US or Canada, of course you can pay with your mobile, but people, some of them still paying cash, obviously credit card, etc. You can even see checks somewhere. So my point is, I believe developing markets, and especially the Middle East, because they don't have this strong infrastructure, have an opportunity to leapfrog.
Brilliant. Prakash, maybe you'd like to jump in there. You have implemented projects, I think, all over the world, but in special India and the Middle East and Europe very much. So what maybe could you add there? And maybe if you'd like to ask a question to Fadi as a follow-up here.
Yeah, thank you, Carlos. And Fadi, I kind of acknowledge what you are saying, but I wanted to actually clarify a frame here and also kind of understand not just AI, but in general, how it is being differentiated by Middle East, right? So let me put the frame first, right? So the frame is, there are a lot of like surveys conducted by McKinsey or Bain or A.T. Kearney, and they always say that 80% of GCC companies have claimed AI adoption, but only about 10% qualify as value realizer, right? Or they have realized value out of the AI adoption. And meaning like only less than 5% have some attribution to earnings because of AI. Okay. So my premise is, I feel there is a actual leapfrog gap from that perspective, because there is, of course, it's not just pertaining to Middle East. I see this in Europe as well, and I see that in Asia also, but the percentages can vary. Maybe they go from 5% to 20%, but there is a gap from a attribution perspective. And also there is a gap from a roadmap perspective on AI in Middle East, because as you rightly said, there is a foundational gap, right? Like there are you have systems of engagement, you have systems of record, there are spaghetti systems and systems of record, there are spaghetti systems and systems of engagement, and it's very tough. So my actual observation is Middle East actually leapfrogging in AI-driven commerce, or is it leapfrogging in AI infrastructure that nobody in CPG is using yet? Is the capital going to data centers, or is it going to like sovereign funds rather than the brands that go to. So which one are you experiencing as a brand? Because I think that's something that I would like to understand. Because I've been talking this to a lot of executives in Middle East and other areas, and there is always this nuance about AI infrastructure adoption and AI, how do you say, uh, attributing real value. You get what I'm trying to say? It's a real challenge from a frame and from an attribution perspective.
Yeah.
So how do you see that from a brand perspective, and how do you see that from a region perspective?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, Prakash. And the Middle East is not leapfrogging. Carlos' question was, do you think the Middle East has the opportunity to leapfrog? And this is where I see a massive opportunity, but it's not being realized. You're absolutely right. And realizing value out of digitalization and AI is not only a Middle Eastern problem. All companies globally are doing fantastic use cases, right, left, and center. Each use case is isolated in a certain brand or customer or geography. You go there, you build the tool, you try it, you develop, you deliver, I'll say anything, 50% upside, 20% cost saving, happy days. Scaling is the issue. And so the problem is not to do a use case here and there. Of course, not easy, obviously, but that's not the problem. The problem is scaling. So this is what's affecting the Middle East right now. But I would say it's affecting everyone. If you go around all the big CPGs, no one has scaled something to the extent of being able to claim or attribute a result globally. There are lots of ambitions. Mars has a fantastic ambition, yet it all depends on scaling. It all depends on these tools covering at least 60% of the turnover, because that's really the point at which you can say something is scaled. Anything below that is not a use case, but a pilot that has been passed, right? So I think in the Middle East, there's not yet any leapfrogging. And I think, so from what I've seen, and again, you guys are closer, from what I've seen, I think I know what the challenge is. And I think it's more the fact that companies are not really thinking of it as a value pool or starting with a value pool and solving a problem. They're thinking of it from a technology point of view. And the risk here, when you think of it as from a technology point of view, you get excited by a tool here, a tool there. For example, there are fantastic tools to forecast. Let's try them. That might not be your problem. You, from a cost point of view, for example, you might have 3-4 people doing forecasting. Of course, if you implement an agent, you might need one person. But having 3-4 people is not the problem. You have 10,000 people selling in the field. That is your problem if you're thinking efficiencies, for example. So I've seen now in developed markets, the companies approach it from a value pool point of view, while in the Middle East, I think it's more still driven from a technology point of view, starting from the solution and seeing what can we make of the solutions versus where our problem really is.
That's a very interesting fork that you brought out, and I kind of get where you're going on that, Fadi. So I want to hold that thought a bit, and I want to expand on that. So just a quick check there, right? So when you say that there is an issue with the use cases and also on the value attribution, what do you think is stopping the scaling? Is it the lack of the foundational element, or is it the lack of business use cases driving the evaluation of the tools, or is it the organization design, or is it like the how do you say, the ability to kind of like, you know, stitch things together and put a cohesive roadmap? What is it that is stopping to scale? Because something, I think everybody understands, okay, we need to do some part of it. And you're absolutely right. I've seen some enterprises in Europe where they have done an AI agent for demand forecasting, order forecasting. They have realized some value, but it doesn't cover the 360 completely. And I kind of get where you're going on that. So what is it? What is that factor that is stopping from your perspective? Because it'll be good to kind of understand from a brand perspective, right? Like, so what is stopping? Because you have the resources, you have probably the systems. I think you have definitely come away from the foundational things, right? It's not that there is a lack of foundational system, but what is stopping from scaling?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question, Prakash. And as I said, no company has scaled to a level where they can claim that they can realize benefits across the globe, really. You've touched on the main reasons, honestly, but I want to add one and reflect on it a little bit. It's the change management, the people, the culture element. Like any change, it's all done by humans at the end of the day, even if it's a digital change that will identify work processes. At the end of the day, humans will have to implement it and use it. And like any change, think Industrial Revolution 200 years ago, it wasn't an easy change. People were rejecting it, right? Because people would think that they would lose their jobs. In reality, humanity evolved in the last 200 years like it had evolved millions of years before that. So it ended up to be a happy outcome for everyone. But at the time, they didn't know, right? So there is resistance. And unless there is a strong change management program internally and strong leadership sponsorship, the change cannot happen. So leadership sponsorship is very important from the very top. So it shouldn't be driven only by the digital leaders. With all respect to the digital leaders, obviously, this should come directly from the CEO. It should be the new language, the new way of doing things, and scaling shouldn't be optional. We're not there as much, right? We're still at a stage where we're doing multiple use cases, etc. But from what I've observed in the industry, change should come from the top, like any change, and it should be that's the way we do business. It should. There's a new agent. Would you like to use it? That's how we're gonna do demand forecasting. That's how we're gonna do pricing. That's how we're gonna do promotion. Like when SAP is implemented in certain companies, it's not optional, right? You do our GM, and there are things I have to do. So answering your question, there are multiple reasons. You've touched on all of them. I can talk about data. I can talk about infrastructure, obviously, but the part that I believe is very important is people and culture. And Pat is here. I mean, she's done a PhD in that, right? So you can definitely give a much better answer than me.
I think on that note, the conversation is super interesting. The conversation took another route. You know, I did an internship at Siemens many years ago. So I worked for the Danish government, then Siemens, and they wanted to hire me there, but I really hated it because it's such a large organization, 300,000 people. And I remember the director saying, "Hey, you're gonna sit in this chair and gonna have an international career." I was like, "No, thanks, not for me." But I had an interesting experience there. I remember that they wanted to do the rollout of the CRM, and I was the guy. I was the intern. I was working in the marketing department, and I had to talk to sales and to everyone there. You know, like, because they didn't. I mean, just for the CRM, like, people didn't want to change, and the president eventually said, "You know what? This is going to affect your bonus," and that's how it happened. So we had like 6 months to force that sort of change, and you know, like, people hated it. And I remember that I was in between IT. I mean, very simple thing. Imagine 13 years ago, me as an intern battling with IT because IT was simply taking my Excel spreadsheet, sending it to Germany. I was like, what the fuck? Can't I talk to Germany directly? Because it makes no sense, you know, like, because it took 2 days, you know, to get stuff like basic stuff. And then for me, that was like really interesting because the inefficiency is in the system. Many times, like there's a system, right? Like in governments, we have inefficiency in these large organizations. You have this bizarre, and I'm not talking about your company, Fadi, but I'm sure it happens too. Bizarre things, people holding to power because, you know, like IT would be so much more efficiency doing something else rather than talking to an intern, you know, and I would have the direct line to the guys in Germany. And perhaps what I want to ask you is, if there's change in an organization, I think whenever you are able to sort of find the low-hanging fruits, and probably sales is a place in an organization where if you can find, you know, if you can test a few initiatives and prove that, well, stuff works, then you are able to scale. So I'm very curious to ask you, like, how are you going about change and implementing change in your organization, in your world, and applying AI and all of that?
Yeah, so that's a great question, and I love your example about being an intern and driving change. Honestly, that's a great experience. Look, what we're learning now as an organization is that to drive change, people need to hear from the user. So we're driving some use cases, and we have users who are people who are operating these tools. In that case, for example, a sales tool, for example, and so a key account manager. And in that case, he's a he, and the way he articulates how his life has changed with the use of the agent is, I mean, I want to go back and work as a key account manager using the tool, because I was doing that job like 25 years ago. So the way he takes it is super engaging. He was just presenting to the MarCEO a couple of weeks ago. And that's a big part of the change, because other users, again, scaling means instead of one user, you have thousands of users. The thousands of users, when they hear from a real user like them, who's doing their job, versus hearing from me or the technology leader, etc., it's much more powerful to hear from a user like them. The way he talked about it, the way he said that he's saving 3 to 4 hours of his day where he was getting data from 5 different departments in 5 different Excel sheets, and he had to make sense of it to identify out of stocks and a shelf somewhere. And then all of this is automated. So he has the time to spend more time with the customer team and build a relationship and talk strategy, identify further opportunities, design new partnerships and promotions, etc., etc., etc. And his business grew by 40 to 50%. And his life is better. He comes home at a reasonable time, and so that's part. I mean, that doesn't solve everything in change management, but that's one thing we've realized, and I've heard many other companies talk about that. Pat and I were in Shop Talk 2 weeks ago, and that's the theme. CEOs talk about having users being at the forefront of the transformation. So that's the key learning that we've realized in a few months.
I think a lot of your work is about spotting the stories also, because in the community, like Gustavo and I, we need to find the stories. It's work also, you know, like to find the stories, the success stories, because sometimes we just hear about the stories 3-4 months ago and they're like, I was hired. Okay, great. But then we also need to discover, and it's kind of like dig, and that hence the importance of talking to our members constantly, you know, like, so it's really interesting. Like it's a really small organization that we have, but I see parallels there for sure. Hendrik, go ahead.
I cannot help but think, listening to this conversation, the more things change, the more they stay the same. Listening to Fadi talk about change management, I feel like I sit at this conversation at least twice a week. And I sometimes wonder, why are we even having this conversation? Because nothing's going to change. Carlos, your story about the attachment of the rollout of your, your intern thing to money, that's how this is going to change.
Mhm.
I'm seeing something really interesting happening. So maybe this is relevant, maybe not. Carlos, tell me if I'm going off the rails. Yeah, I'll go back.
You're always very welcome. Go ahead. Let's
Okay.
see where you go.
So I'm seeing in the United States, I'm seeing brands and platforms throwing every human resource at AI, and you are being forced to use it, which is leading to CFOs basically saying, we can't do this because of the tokens.
Mhm.
So I'm seeing that problem, and I think what Fadi's explained, I think is happening at a global scale in most CPG brands, because the CPG brands have a challenge in the sense that they work with the real world. In most cases, there is no data about how many times a human comes to an aisle and looks at a Mars product. Right. So we have that. Then we have China saying, you know what? We're going to take this a completely different way, and we're going to throw artificial intelligence at industrial problems. So how can we use resources better, i.e. our grid, the mining sector? So the reason why I call this out is this is the challenge that brands are facing. Am I solving a macro thing? So I'm going to be like Klarna, and I'm going to tell the entire world, oh, sorry, maybe. Oh, yeah. Anyway, Klarna, don't ask me for a check. I'm not going to promote you in any case. I'm just telling you the facts. Klarna told us all they killed the customer service team, and it basically helped them financially. However, what did they solve? Last time I checked, the answer is nothing. They admitted months later it was a disaster. The point that I'm trying to say is that when we have people that are remunerated based on share prices, why the hell will they make a change when it impacts their salary?
Mhm.
Maybe I've completely gone a million directions, but I think the macro versus the minor thing, I think, is the biggest challenge businesses are struggling with. Workflows are easy to create for, a department. But if you have multiple partners and multiple businesses working with a particular funnel, I think we have not yet got to the point where things can be like passed around and it can be solved. I will just say, I think the CPG sector has the most pain to deal with, because let's be honest, at the end of the day, their biggest challenge is spillage and challenges about making money, because in most cases margins are thin. So adding this places more stress on people that are already stressed. I look forward to the comments on this, but I think I will just say what I'm hearing from this is the more things change, the more they stay the same.
That deserves an expert session in itself. Patricia, you had raised your hand. Thanks, Henry.
Yeah, I think I don't want to deviate the conversation from Henrik's comment, but somehow it's related. So I was thinking, I also have this feeling of things never change, because I've been in this space of transforming big corporations for the last 20 years. So it seems that I'm in the marmota day, like when I listen always the same, and the change is really slow. That's why I do believe and agree with Fadi when he says it's about human, like it's about human from all perspectives, right? So how much do we consider the users or the operating model that we need to change, but also it's about the leadership, right? So it's about And I had like an interesting insight like a couple of years ago when I just realized that almost 20 years ago, I started my career in e-commerce, right? So almost 20 years ago, I would look to Google Analytics to check what were the top seller products to define what was a product that we would put in Orkut, right? It was that time, right? So I realized that I had, as some of you here, I believe you also had, a compounding effect of what is data, how do you take decisions based on data, what is technology. So I never worked directly in technology, but I was always close to that. So for me, it's quite easy to understand how does AI work, because 20 years ago, I was using Google Analytics. And if we try to apply this to a CPG world, because that's also where I've been working in the last 15 years. So most of the executives started their career there. Everything that they learned was there. So there is an important tension between wanting, like the pressure on the executives at the moment, beyond the pressure on the business, right? Beyond high costs, like rising costs, beyond all of this, if we just think about digital implications, we have people who has been working in such a way in the last 10 years, 20 years, and then suddenly they have to change everything and understand something that it's really difficult because it's just, they didn't have this kind of compounding learning, right? So it's difficult to understand. So I feel it's more like a question because I think we have the privilege of having Fadi, because Fadi is one of the few guys, and I told him this, I've met few senior executives who had built a career in a traditional company, but still are open and understand the new, right? Usually people reject it, even if they don't say. Even when they most of them, they don't say, but it's just they are not really open to that. So I think for me, there is a key tension that we need to solve that would allow this change to really happen is when we have leadership that is really open, and then when we create incentives that allow people to really go beyond, walk the talk, right? Stop talking about the transformation and really start doing. So I think the question for me to Fadi is, it's not about Mars, but it's more about someone who has built a career in this. How do we change this? So what is, because I personally felt this in the last 15 years, in all company, in every market that I worked, I faced senior executives resistant to do these new things. And I feel there is an element of facilitating this testing. I think that's the human, how could we facilitate for the leadership to go in this direction? Because I feel that today they are under pressure. It's not because they don't want to, like, that's how my opinion is, like, they want to do and they know they have to, but they don't have the expertise to do it. So it's really critical, right? You are in a position where you need to make decisions on something that you don't know, that you don't have the experience. It involves many times millions. So so question one is, did you see it? And from your perspective as someone who navigates both worlds, what do you think? Because this for me is what could change this Marmota Day feeling.
I'm sorry, Tamer. I'll answer Pat and Henrik's questions, which, as I said, are related. So thank you for the question, Henrik. I love your philosophical view on things. I also believe things don't change. I'm a big reader of history, like probably most of you, and things keep repeating, right? In different eras, etc. Things keep repeating. So the risk, the challenge with AI is that the narrative out there is the world is changing, the old life is ending, and there's a new life out there. And because the media's job is to dramatize things, to generate more likes and views. So the reality is not that. Even if you go to the Industrial Revolution 200 years ago, the world didn't really change, it improved. At the end of the day, CPGs will continue to develop and sell products and try to sell more of them and develop them in a cheaper way. That's what they do, right? And the moment we position AI as It's not the end of the word and the beginning of the new word. It's not you have to abandon everything and start new. No, it is a tool to do what you're supposed to do, sell more, lower cost, in a better way. That's it. And I've been privileged. I mean, part of leading this program within Mars, I go and talk to the regional presidents, etc. And that's how we position it at the end of the day. It is enabling you to deliver your P&L better, enabling you to sell more with a lower cost. So the moment you chunk it in pieces and talk to the executives in their language, link it to their own objectives. Again, you've touched on objectives. You link it to their own objectives. Their own objectives are mostly about top line and bottom line, right? Return on investment. So how does AI technology link or help them to deliver their objectives? And then you cut it in pieces. Again, I'm not saying I cracked it, but the moment you crack, you break it into pieces. So that's your entire process. You have 2-3 bottlenecks. Let's go and identify these 2-3 bottlenecks versus getting lost in trying to identify everything. And the risk, again, is that the industry. So again, when you go to an exhibition, you have 1,000 vendors trying to sell you 1,000 solutions of 1,000 things to identify. You don't need to identify all these things. You need to start with 2 or 3 things, but then someone has to help you. Someone needs to come, scan your workflow, identify the bottlenecks, and tell you, we're going to identify 2 or 3 things. So long answer, but I think there needs to be a layer that would help executives. By layer, I mean either internal or outsourced, help them navigate this very complex world, talk to them in their language, cut it into pieces, more digestible, and help them on where to start, right? They only need to start. They don't need to scale now. They just need to start. So I don't know if I've answered your question, but these are the few things I've observed over the last few months.
Brilliant. Bachi, has he answered your question, do you think? Or any, yeah? Thank you. Tomer, you have a question there?
Yeah, I have a quick one. I want to bring us back to the Middle East. I want to get Fadi's futuristic view on the relationship between how potentially technology or digitization can leapfrog in this part of the world.
Yeah.
But again, when you look at infrastructure on the ground, predominantly traditional trade markets, e-commerce or quick commerce is picking up, but still only serving big cities. Data is few and far between to get into a true understanding of what's really happening on the ground. And I'm more thinking stores, retail, rather than consumers, because I think on consumers we have a better bearing on understanding what's going on to some extent. But how do you see fulfillment in the light of all this, Fadi? I mean, we're still far away from ensuring that we're having the right SKUs on the shelves in the right places. How do you see that future, with maybe leapfrogging on the technology side, understanding, but on the ground, we cannot deliver, we cannot fulfill. I want to get your idea or future view on that.
Yeah, Tamer, you're spot on. There is a fundamental challenge in terms of infrastructure and data. That's real. I still think that's an opportunity, right? Because it would be easier with the right investment, etc., to build a new system when you don't have an old system to dismantle. But still, the infrastructure is not there. You don't have addresses. You have 400,000 stores. Most of them do not have a physical address. You don't have a road infrastructure. The supply chain is very disjointed, etc., etc., etc. So you do have a lot. When I say you, I mean we have here in Egypt a lot of infrastructure challenges. On the other side, the willingness, the desire is there, and that's what I felt a bit more even than other parts of the world, because it would really solve problems. Imagine a sales rep in Egypt, and many of us have been sales reps in Egypt. Your daily life is really tough, really tough. You have to navigate route plans that are not realistic because they were designed 2 or 3 years ago. Half of the stores do not exist anymore. Half of them don't even have the cash to buy your product. Half of them have stock already when you go to them because there's no way to see what they have on the shelf. So imagine having a tool that would give you dynamic routing and would guide you to the next store and the next store based on the forecast of what this store would sell tomorrow because there is an event in a school next to a store, for example. Of course, this doesn't exist today, but the adoption, the moment the infrastructure is there and the tool exists, I'm not worried about the adoption. I've seen 15, 20 years ago, SFAs being implemented in the Middle East, and honestly, the implementation was very smooth because it was offering solutions that they actually needed. So answering your question, I think it's going to be a long way. The government is quite supportive. So I think very soon there will be other. I mean, we've seen how Amazon has cracked the lack of addresses, and now Amazon practically delivers everywhere in Egypt without physical addresses, using a combination of location and triangulation, etc. So there are ways around it. There are ways to solve it. Quick commerce, yes, only in big cities, but quick commerce doesn't even exist in developed markets. So to get something delivered in 20 minutes in Egypt, 7 minutes in India, and I saw it in rural India, that's a logistical miracle. So these miracles are possible with the right investment and with the right intentionality. So I am optimistic, but it will take time. But I still believe with the right intentionality, the right government support, the Middle East can leapfrog.
Thank you. Yunut, your question.
No, it's not a question. I had if it's welcome, I have the perspective about the change, because we discussed about the change and how companies embrace technology and AI. And to be just very short, from what I can see in my region, big corporation is very hard to change, indeed. And the feeling of nothing is changing is there, because most of the people, either they're lazy or they prefer to stay in the comfort zone. Some of the people are really innovators and they want to test and create things, no matter the position that they have in the companies. Luckily, sometimes they have a high position and they can influence and have impact to the organization. But some other times they are middle management or even below that. They are able to do change, but they are not entitled to do the change. The real change that is happening in the business, I see in more entrepreneurial companies, where the change is driven exactly by the owner or the executive officer. And there, the AI is better embraced and create impacts. On the other side, nowadays I can see in discussions when hiring people, some companies, more entrepreneurial companies, they're not asking if you are using AI or not. They're asking how many agents do you use. So some things will change, definitely, but not with the speed that some other people would prefer to happen. But it's always about the people. We are facing now the AI evolution or revolution, or evolution, I would say, because someone dreamed about that. So this is part of the human thing that we really enjoy. Some people, they are so smart enough to imagine something that are not yet developed, but their commitment will make the change and the impact that we will benefit of their imaginations. Like that, we have electricity, cars, TV, Google Meet, and so on. So in our humanity, people will continue to imagine things and to develop things. Now, with the help of AI, probably this process will accelerate, and all those imaginations will become part of our life faster. Applications, tools, and some things that we don't know today what is going to happen, but this is going to happen faster, most probably, because people will continue to dream, to imagine, and some smart people will take those imaginations and put into the practice. That's.
I love that provocation, and I agree that change will be slow, and I think it's fine. I mean, slow compared to the expectation that everything has to change overnight, but that's not a realistic expectation. So if change happens over 5-6 years, that's super fast already in the scheme of things, right? So I think we need to be realistic with the expectations of change. And I think another factor that will affect how companies change is that when all the external environment changes, they will have to change. So for example, back to CPG again, because that's what I know. Customers, the big customers that CPGs work with, the Walmarts of the world, the Tesco's of the world, the Carrefours, they are implementing their own agents. And at a point in time, they will require companies to have their own agents, CPGs, to have their own agent to talk to their customer agents. So if you are a company, if you have not driven change, if you have not invested, you will be left behind. Customers will not want, they will prioritize other suppliers over you. So you need to keep up with the industry. You cannot be left behind. So, and this is where scaling will really happen. Now, not in the next, I think, 2-3 years, but I think over the next 5 years, this is where it will really, really grow exponentially.
It's more like perhaps a philosophical observation about change. Not sure if it's philosophical or not, but let's see where we're going with this. You see, I was in Romania, I think in October, and I was very impressed by what I saw there, because I in 2017, 2018, I've been to Romania maybe 17, 18 times, because I was doing the expansion of VTEX back then. And China wasn't there, like the Chinese company, maybe at like small mom and pop.
Barely.
Right? China wasn't there. But, last year I was there and I saw the BYDs there. I was like, what's going on? And whatever other car brands they have and so on. And so I think change is inevitable, like someone is going to come and eat your lunch if you fall asleep at the wheel. That's what I'm trying to say. Like you have in Brazil it's the same. You have this narrative and I think a lot going on. And I always say that I think it's impossible not to talk or to touch politics these days when we're having these discussions, like, so in Brazil, the government typically has been very diplomatic. So they buy, the US will tell them, hey, you cannot buy Huawei. They say we buy both, we play on both sides. And what I'm trying to say is like, the same way I saw China, in Romania, and I thought it was really interesting. I think what Yanut is saying, that entrepreneurs, China has this entrepreneurial mindset, of thinking the government is backing a lot of initiatives and they're very aggressive. They're quiet but aggressive, so. I think it's really interesting, and I don't. It's more like in this sense that perhaps we have to finish the call soon, but what do you think if you were at the board, Fadi, of your company? What should they do to where should they invest their time to implement change and perhaps have more like an entrepreneurial organization? I went to China, I went multiple ways, and I'm trying to make a point here. Someone is always going to come and gonna create change. That's my point. So China is in Romania today. They're very aggressive. There's India also, right, Prakash? So multiple Indian CEOs, right? We can talk about that. So China, not China, but change is happening. And I think there's this idea sometimes that you're too big to fail, but you can fail, right? So there's no guarantees. Maybe it's just gonna take a little longer for you to fail, but So if you were at the board, what would you do? What would you recommend? If you're
Great question, and you touched on the fact that CPGs are less agile than smaller companies by nature, and they have to be more cautious when you when you're leading a 70, 80, 90 billion dollar business, you have multi-billion dollar brands, you need to be cautious. So I do understand why, but the price to pay is that you are less agile in terms of innovation, etc. This is changing now very quickly, and technology is helping. But you need to implement the right boundaries and governance, which by design slows down the process. But again, the price to pay if you don't implement the right boundaries and governance is that you can have multi-billion dollar brands canceled overnight. And we've seen that in many, many companies. So that's why it is difficult to act with an entrepreneurial spirit when you're a big CPG. I'm not talking about Mars, but I'm talking about most. Mars is a private company. I mean, we're still a massive CPG, but we are a private company, family owned. Which gives us the luxury of being more agile. Of course, not like a small company, but more agile. So back to your question, if I were on the board, so I'm not on the board, I wish I was on the board. If I were on the board, look, I think any change happens when you do two things. A, you put the right resources behind it, people, and a strong change management program, which requires resources. That's one. And two, you have sponsorship from the top. The board, the CEO, they may make public appearances, they're always out there talking. And from their narrative, of any company, you can easily detect what they care about, right? It's not what they say, but it's in the percentage of what they talk about, their body language, etc. And again, now with AI, you can put all of the YouTube videos and get an answer on what's on their mind, etc. Right? Beyond what they're actually talking about. I'm not talking about only CEOs, any speaker. You really need to embed it in the leadership narrative so that employees, vendors, suppliers, the entire ecosystem know that this is the case. We can easily name companies where, for example, sustainability is a priority, right? We can easily name companies where we know digital is a priority from everything we hear about these companies. So answering your question, I would say put the right resources, not just the intentionality, the resources. There needs to be, so if there's an intention for a digital AI transformation, put a team. Mars has done that. So put a team, not just the current team, not just add it as a task to the current team. No, put a completely separate, dedicated team, give them authority, give them a budget, and put the right senior leadership there, and make the entire narrative about doing a digital transformation. That's what I would do.
Brilliant. Thank you. Prakash, we'll have to end the call. Perhaps you have a final question as my co-host, or a final remark there. A final remark there on the session.
Absolutely. I do have some final remarks, but I'm very curious to just understand one important thing about sovereign AI in Middle East from Fadi's perspective, because I know that Middle East is very particular about the data partition by the region, right? Like the geo partition, where all cloud platforms and all the AI platform companies are trying to keep the data within the region, right? How do you see that from a region, specifically on cross-border purchase signals, right? When you look at cross-border perspective, does data sovereignty actually enable transaction or AI-driven commerce, or is it restricting it? Because a lot of times it puts a little bit of restriction, because the AI model cannot train on cross-border purchase signals, right, Fadi? So I'm curious to hear your point of view on that.
Well, Prakash, I'm not a data person. I'm a business person, those leading. So
Yeah.
I'm not as close as you are, but if I understood your question right, the Middle East is putting a bit more restrictions on data, etc.,
Yes.
which restricts. Yeah. I know that I'm not that close, but I know that. It is definitely one of the challenges, like the other infrastructure challenges. So I don't know how this would evolve, but I think very soon data will be commoditized and no one, be it a government or no one, will be able to try to control the data because it will be out there, right? And there will be a challenge to companies selling data. And sorry, Tamer, I know you're not with Nielsen anymore, but the business of selling data will be under pressure because data will be out there. The question will be, what do you do with the data? And I know the Nielsen's of the world have started doing that. So probably not the answer you're expecting, Prakash. Sorry if I'm not that close.
No, no. I was just curious to know because as a brand and being in the region, as Patricia was mentioning, I think there's something that I hear from a lot of enterprises in the region, but also I do see that some of the enterprises are overcoming that, but it is a very important consideration for a lot of big companies in the region, right? They just wanted to kind of keep the data in the region, and they also want to do cross border, which is kind of like a little bit of, how do you say, conflicting goals, right? It's very tough to implement that level of personalization, right? So
I actually didn't know about it as well. So I just asked Gemini if that's okay, because then we all learn. To understand sovereign AI in the Middle East, it helps to look at a simple analogy: renting an apartment versus building your own house. When most people or companies use AI right now, they are renting. They use American apps like GPT or Gemini. The data goes to US servers, and the US government or private tech companies control the rules, the data, and who gets access.
Yeah.
Sovereign AI means building the entire house locally. Middle Eastern governments like the UAE and Saudi want to fully own and control the computers, the software, the data, and the brains behind the AI, so they never have to rely on outside countries. I mean, but isn't it what China does as well? And then, I mean, in a certain way, like they say, okay, or they want you to have the servers there, and as long as you comply. And I'm not an expert. I'm raising the question more like Prakash, since you brought it.
So Carlos, sorry to interrupt that. So the China analogy is interesting, and thank you for bringing that, because for China, the local market is so big that for them it doesn't really matter. For like they can like build their own house and still be very profitable, right? Like it's still like a thing, because the market is so big, and I'm okay to kind of build my own house. But when you're looking at different types of markets, when you look at certain market in Europe or certain market in Middle East, it's very important to kind of like build like ecosystems and cross border and build multi-region platforms, right? And this is where the data sovereignty comes into play, because the LLMs or the AI models are not ready to handle the sovereign AI part yet, right? And that's why I was just curious to hear that.
Would it make sense to have some sort of consortium? Let's say if you're an international company, let's say GPT and Amazon, they could get together and say, okay, would it make sense, or is it a crazy idea because the market isn't as large as?
Yeah, it makes sense, but they have not yet created that. So right now there are rules which are governing KSA, which is Saudi Arabia. There are governing rules which is governing Oman. There are governing rules which is governing other parts of Middle East. But I think the consortium approach has not come yet, right? So that's
Okay. Cool.
it's one of the open areas that I think probably it will evolve. But I got Fadi's answer. I think from a business perspective, brands want to make data as a commodity, right? Like, and that's kind of like something that we need to see how it evolves.
Brilliant. Thank you, Prakash.
I
right.
think as long as
Yeah.
we're discussing data, I need to make a comment, and I know Fadi threw it there. He threw a curveball at me. I don't think anybody knows how this thing is going to evolve. There are too many moving pieces yet. I also believe it's going to be potentially a longer journey than the one you talk about with change and coming to a big change in the next 5 to 6 years. I think it's potentially longer. There are too many parties involved. And I think it's also an evolution. Potentially, yes, data might be there, but then the question is, how do you use it? What do you use it for? And what is the role of information services companies in the future is still to be figured out. So I think it's interesting times for us to see, and a lot of convergence are going to happen on what we do and how we do it.
Thank you, Tamer. All right, so Fadi, this is amazing. Another session. If people want to know more about you, what's the best way? What's the best way to connect? I mean, if you're in Evolve, surely we can facilitate that, but for the ones outside of Evolve.
Well, first of all, thank you very much. I love the discussion, love the questions. Again, I didn't have all the answers, but I personally learned a lot today, so thank you. To connect, I'm on LinkedIn. That's probably the easiest way. So please reach out, and happy to continue having the discussion. I mean, you've brought amazing points, philosophical points, and I am on a learning journey myself. So let's keep exchanging.
I think we all are, absolutely. Yeah.
So thank you once again, and don't hesitate to reach out anytime.
Amazing.
Thank you.
So thank you, Tamer. Thank you, Hendrik, Andy, Yonut, Prakash, Gustavo. Thank you all. Amazing session. See you all next week. All the best.
Yeah.
Ciao.
Thank you, Carlos. See you, Fadi.
Thanks very much.
See you, folks.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.